Slavery was abolished in 1865 in the U.S., and yet 150 years later, its legacy still lingers upon African Americans. Slavery has always been a dark mark in America's history. America started as a refuge to the outcast, a place for people who didn't belong to create a new life, and yet it became as a slave culture. Slaves weren't even treated like human. It was as if their skin color separated them from humanity. Before America could rid its democracy of the horrible institution of slavery, a tragic civil war had to be fought. The end of slavery was just the beginning of another period in which African Americans continued to struggle for their freedoms as citizens of the United States. Even today, this legacy lives on. People of color are given fewer opportunities than people of European descent. Through poverty, incarceration, police death, and education statistics, we can see the real problem with the U.S. The true hard fact is that America has never been and will not be the land of the free until all its races are treated in an equal and fair way.
You can see racism in many areas. For example, poverty rates. If you look at the following graphs, you will notice that the African Americans make up a significantly higher percentage of poor Americans. This next graph measures the poverty rates of children. The orange bar represents the percentage of poor black children, and as you can see, it is higher than any other race. Another area where you can see the legacy of slavery and racism is in education and school systems. During the mid-1900s, the idea of segregation and separate but equal became very popular. African American children attended lower quality schools than white children and received poorer education. The Brown versus the Board of Education case is an example of this problem. In this trial, parents complained that their children were forced to walk more than a mile to reach a segregated school, when a white school was closer to them. This case was brought to the Supreme Court, where after months of debate, it was finally decided that segregation was unjust and the desegregation of all public schools in 21 states was forced. However, even after this, there is still racism in school. This graph measures the percentage of a certain race enrolled in college. The African American bar is one of the lowest, along with the Hispanic bar, with only a 38% of all African Americans attending college. This next graph measures the number of males by race with a 4-year college degree. The African American line, or the blue line, is one of the lowest on the graph, suggesting that blacks have the least amount of college degrees. In this graph, the first collection of bars represents the total amount of enrolled preschoolers by race. The red bar denotes African Americans and shows that only 18% of all black preschoolers attend preschool. This next group of bars shows the percent of preschoolers who received a suspension. The African American bar towers over the white column, with an astonishing 42% of all black preschoolers having been suspended once. The next section measures the amount of preschoolers who have received multiple suspensions, and like before, the black bar is much taller than the white bar with a total of 48%. This next graph presents the fact that the rate of African Americans are held back 2 or more times is nearly twice of that of whites.
Another example of racism involves arrests, more specifically drug arrests. The first graph measures the usage of marijuana. Pink represents white Americans, and black represents black Americans. The bars are relatively equal, meaning that both black and white people use around the same amount of drugs. However, in the next graph, you will notice that the black bars are remarkably higher. This graph measures the amount of drug arrests. Black people use less drugs than white people, but are 6 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs.
A huge example of racism today involves police-related deaths. The deaths of Eric Gardner, Freddie Gray, and Michael Brown caused protests and riots across the country and angered many people. These were not the only police-related African American deaths. This chart exhibits the percent of people killed by police who were African Americans among other races in certain cities. In Chicago, 91% of the people killed by police were black. In New York, 87% of the people killed by police were African Americans. And in Rockford, Illinois, and Saginaw, Michigan, 100% of the people killed by police were black. This next graph shows that African American ages 20 to 24 are more likely than any other group to be killed by law enforcement.
The legacy of slavery is extremely prominent in incarceration rates. This graph shows that African Americans are incarcerated nearly 5 times more than whites and around 2 times more than Latinos. This next graph shows similar results. The African American bar, or the blue bar, towers over the white Hispanic bars, proving how much more black people are arrested.
Though a civil war was fought and slavery was abolished 150 years ago, racism is still present in our society today. Though slavery itself is not legal in the United States, lasting effects of slavery are present in African Americans' lives. Issues such as poverty, prejudice, and unfair incarcerations cannot be fixed if we, the citizens, do not acknowledge them and do something about it. There are many people who are fortunate enough to have a steady job, a place to live, and an education. Those are the people who can help the most, but have chosen to ignore the growing problem our country faces. The issue of racism will never solve itself and can go on just as long as it has existed if people do not take action. To solve the problem of racism is with education. Education can fix the entrenched poverty and the hopelessness African Americans are feeling. With little education, African Americans can get jobs that can support their families. With more money, the temptation to commit crimes is much lower. Less crime means less incarcerations. The black incarceration rates will go down and lessen the judgment from the police. Educating poor African Americans is a step in the right direction to end the ever-growing racism in America.